So just to be aware of that, if you prefer not to be seen, you can do that. And we will mute everybody while Mia is speaking, so that keeps the noise level down. So, oh, hello, Harriet. Good, people coming in. Oh, and coming in droves now. So there we are. John, hello. Okay, Mia, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I see some familiar faces. I see some names that are familiar, whose faces I haven't seen. And it's really good to be here. It's quite fitting for me to speak about this festival just now, because it was exactly 5 years ago in March 2018 when I went to the beloved Jewish actor Ida Schuster's home in Giffnock in Glasgow. And it was a very rare opportunity because Ida was about to celebrate her 100th birthday, and she passed away not very long after that. And Ida had been a theater actor in both the Jewish theater and professional worlds, and she was a director and really a key cultural figure in the Glasgow arts community. And I had been investigating Jewish culture in Scotland as part of a very large government-funded project on Scottish Jewish migration history. And I sat there at her dining room table, and she opened her arms and she said, "Ich bin an archive, I'm an archive." And she had this very knowing look and almost an impish smile. And she was welcoming me to delve into the pages of her life. And it was certainly the most entertaining archive that I had ever been to. I sat having tea at her dining room table, surrounded of photos of her children in Israel and portraits of herself on stage and awards reflecting her successful stage career. And it was rare enough to find someone who could recall a century of life with such vivid detail. But I had come to her home not only to find out about her life in the theater. I was there to gain insight into one very grand festival of Jewish arts that took place in Glasgow in 1951, in which Ida had played a key role. More specifically, I was interested in how the very recent devastation of the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel had influenced the organization and choices for the exhibition. And this was for an article that I was hoping to write, which I did write. But of course, Ida didn't know that I was after that, or so I thought. Now, as David said in the introduction, the Festival of Jewish Arts in Glasgow, Britain's second city at the time, was conceived as a response to, and it was timed to coincide with the much larger Festival of Britain in 1951. Glasgow's Jewish Festival was the first and the largest festival specifically dedicated to Jewish arts in the UK. It was privately funded by the Jewish community in Glasgow, and it was held from the 4th to the 25th of February of 1951. Remarkably, the displays showcased works from over 50 internationally known artists, including Marc Chagall and Camille Pissarro, Amedeo Modigliani, Chaim Soutine, Jacob Epstein, Joseph Herman, and Yanko Adler, among many others. On display as well were antiquities dating back from the 13th century. There were films and musical performances. There was also a display of over 2,000 books and lectures by the artist Joseph Herman and renowned philosopher Martin Buber. There were also a run of sellout performances of S. Ansky's The Dybbuk by Glasgow's award-winning Jewish Institute players, in which Ida, who was a well-established actor in her 30s at the time, played the lead role of Leah to rave reviews. And The Dybbuk was one of the most well-known Jewish plays at that point in time. I had many questions for Ida that afternoon. First of all, why an art festival? What audience was it aimed at? And why in Glasgow? And moreover, what did it tell us about what was important to the leaders of the Jewish community at that time? Perhaps some of my questions were also leading to an ulterior motive that may be more leading than I had intended, because my theory was that the festival itself was haunted by the undead spirit of Jewish life cut short by the devastation in the Shoah. And this was much like the theme of the Dybbuk, the play that played so centrally in that festival. Now, Ida was quick to put me and my theory in its place. Academics like to put things into little boxes, she admonished me. That's not how it was. Well, how was it then? Like any historical event, it would be very difficult to know exactly how the Festival of Arts was and for whom. There's some evidence of its nature. There's a program in the Scottish Jewish Archive Centre. There's one copy of the exhibition guide and art catalog at the National Library of Scotland and at the Yiddish Institute in New York. There were some opening speeches and reviews in Glasgow's Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Echo, and brief mentions in a couple of other Scottish newspapers at the time. But there are no critical analyses of the festival. There's not much historical information, and there's no record of attendance, although the Echo does refer to one. There's no floor plans, and very few people alive who remember the event, aside from Ida, who I caught right in time. And yet, from a wider Jewish cultural studies perspective, the festival provides a very rare opportunity to look at a particular post-war performance of Jewish art. And in many ways, it illuminates the ways in which local performances of Jewishness are rooted in a social and political moment. More importantly, it broadens our understandings of the ideologies behind exhibiting Jewishness in art and how these performances respond to historically fraught issues such as migration, belonging, nationalism, otherness, and even minority self-construction in respect to mainstream culture. Especially when you look at the material and tangible elements of the festival, alongside the social and cultural ideals of its organizers, you can discern a complex negotiation between the historical place and space of the festival, the concerns of the Jewish community, and the tensions between minority and mainstream Scottish and British culture. So with these issues in mind, today I want to briefly look at what award-winning scholar of performance and museums, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, calls the performance of display of the art festival, and especially within a post-World War II social and political context. I'll also be interrogating what organizers and key performers constructed as Jewish and what we can learn from this process. So I'll do that by first taking a look at the historical context of the post-war festival and why Glasgow. And let's say if this is different, for instance, from London, which had a much larger Jewish community. And then I'll take a closer look at the program and media coverage to probe how social and political anxieties about Jewish migration and refugees, about anti-Semitism, may have influenced the organizers and their exhibition. So first question, why 1951 and why is Glasgow significant to a study of Jewish migrant art? So key to my analysis of the content and focus of the 1951 event is the distinction between an exhibition and a festival, especially in regard to what we may call today ethnic minorities or religious minorities. According to Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, both exhibitions and festivals display a performance of ethnic identification for minority groups. A festival, however, unlike a museum exhibit, is, to quote Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, governed by an aesthetic of pure theatricality. So in other words, festivals depend on the performative. They depend on it to synthesize and encapsulate a simplified idea of ethnicity that is in actuality rather complex. And because festivals are so compressed, they're also intensely political moments of display, which is what makes this particular event in Glasgow significant for a study of post-war British Jewish culture. So what's special about 1951 and Glasgow as a location? Well, to be sure, this was not the only large Jewish art exhibition that had been held in Britain. There was a very important section of the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition in 1887 in London that featured artworks. And then 10 years later, the Whitechapel Art Gallery in London held its first major Jewish exhibition dedicated solely to art in 1906. It was called Jewish Art and Antiquities, and it had over 2,000 works. But in this period of time, to quote Ida again, people seem to be festival mad. And when the chair and organizer, Benno Schultz, from the Royal Scottish Academy, he was head of sculpture at the Glasgow School of Art, he opened the Festival of Jewish Arts on the 9th of February. And he declared the time had been considered ripe for Jews to take stock of their cultural achievements and to see where they stood in relation to the general stream of culture for the benefit of themselves and their children. So I asked myself, why was that time ripe? Well, for the one thing, as mentioned, the Festival of Britain was to take place that summer, and its goal was to highlight the nation and its peoples. According to Schutz's memoir, the Jews of Glasgow wanted to assert their own idea of how they fit among those peoples and the nation. The Festival of Britain, of course, was held to mark the centenary of the Great Exhibition of 1851. And it used 11 million pounds of public funds at a time of near national bankruptcy. It was also deeply enmeshed in post-war concerns about British identity, famously described by its director, Sir Gerald Barry, as a tonic to the nation. It held thousands of events all across the country, and more than 8 million people visited the main festival site in London on the south bank of the Thames River. King George's speech at the opening of the Festival of Britain makes the point of that festival clear. Two worlds have brought, you can imagine King George, I'm just channeling him. 2 world wars have brought us grievous loss of life and treasure. And though the nation has made a splendid effort towards recovery, new burdens have fallen upon it and dark clouds still overhang the whole world. Yet this is no time for despondency, for I see this festival as a symbol of Britain's abiding courage and vitality. The dark clouds that overhung Britain were economic, but it also had to do with a crisis in national identity, or what could be called Britishness in a post-empire world. And perhaps it's not surprising that in the immediate decade following World War II, Britain saw a surge of support for arts festivals and cultural events as a way not only to invigorate the economy and raise morale, but also importantly to shore up national identity. The Edinburgh International Festival, founded in 1947 by Austrian-born Jew Sir Rudolf Bing, is one such an example. But there were other cultural projects that enjoyed an increase in funding for music and theater. There were social clubs. It was formalized. The establishment of the government-aided Arts Council was formalized in 1945 by Liberal politician Lord Maynard Keynes. And if the impression was that art and culture could transcend the troubles of the period, then the drive for public education was also part of that post-war zeitgeist. In the period between 1947 to 1951, for example, evening institutes aimed at adult education more than doubled from about 5,000 to 11,000. And registrations increased from 825,000 to 1.2 million. Public lectures, study groups, and educational books aimed at the general public all enjoyed increased support. Evidence that Glasgow's Jewish community took a great part in that cultural and educational zeitgeist is clear from the records and pamphlets held at the Scottish Jewish Archive Centre in Glasgow. Although not the largest of Jewish populations in Britain, it was certainly one of the most active. There were a number of weekly study groups, there were book clubs, lectures, there was an active theater group, as well as men's and women's clubs, dances, and socials. Glasgow held the first Jewish Book Week in 1937, well before London's more renowned one in 1952. It was also home to a widely successful and award-winning Jewish theater group, the Jewish Institute Players, led by Avram Greenbaum, who was a playwright, director, and actor. And this is one of the reasons why looking at Glasgow rather than London, which is usually the focus of British Jewish culture, is so valuable. Benno Schoetz's claim in his memoir was that the festival could not have happened in London. In Glasgow, the community was, at least according to some, less divided along social or political lines than a bigger Jewish center. But it was also a community of constantly shifting demographics due to migration, which makes this a noteworthy case study as well. Although there's been a Jewish community in Scotland since the 18th century, at the turn of the 20th century, Scotland had a very small Jewish population of about 4,000. By 1911, this grew to 12,000. And then a third influx of refugees fleeing from Nazism saw this number grow to 20,000 by mid-century. And now it's back to about 4,000 or 5,000. So while only 3% of Britain's Jewish population of 450,000, which itself was only 0.5% of the entire population, the influx of migrants to Glasgow and to Scotland brought an extraordinary number of artists and Jewish artists to Glasgow. Aside from the sculptor Benno Schoetz, who came from Estonia in 1912, and as I mentioned, was head of sculpture and ceramics at the Glasgow School of Art, there were also a number of influential painters who either were immigrants or came as refugees in the 1930s and 40s. One was Joseph Herman and another Janko Adler, who both left the city in 1943. Schoetz and Adler had even held a successful earlier exhibition at the Jewish Institute in Glasgow in 1942, entitled Jewish Art. As a whole, more than 300 painters and sculptors and graphic artists came to Britain to flee Nazi oppression from 1933 until the end of World War II. And a number of scholars and art historians have noted the influence these refugee artists had on the British art scene. They introduced experimental modernist aesthetics such as expressionism, cubism, and surrealism. This was arguably even more influential in Scotland. According to Douglas Hall in his study of refugee artists in Britain, England had a national art to boast of, and English artists stuck with what they knew. Scottish art, as he argues, with its tradition of colorism, was perhaps more open to European influences. Moreover, the smaller artistic community in Scotland, many of whom associated with Glasgow's famed School of Art and Benno Schoetz, welcomed the refugee artists with their new approaches and were sympathetic to what could be seen as a Jewish style that they came with. Glasgow's new art club, which began in 1940, also provided a meeting place for some of those less conventional artists with very modest hanging fees. But in terms of the politics of exhibiting Jewish art in post-war period, Glasgow's Festival of Jewish Arts had an interest in downplaying the Jewish refugee image. which was so prevalent in the media at the time. Its aim was to outline very clearly how Jews and Jewish artists could contribute to an international, pluralist vision of British culture. Organizers made clear in letters and press releases that the art world could provide an entry point. It could explain Jewishness in a way that was palatable to the intended audience of non-Jewish spectators, and it could influence positively how Jewishness was constructed. To quote Schotz's memoir, the festival attracted the attention of the non-Jewish public to the cultural contribution of the Jews to the world at a time when it was needed. And perhaps what was needed was an intervention into many of the stereotypes of Jews in the British media, including impressions that Jews were wandering refugees and perpetual victims on the one hand, and economic powerhouses and political agitators on the other, whether for communism, capitalism, or Zionism. It was an image that was buttressed by the arrival of the 60,000 or so Jewish refugees from Germany to Britain during the 1930s. Jews, as historian Tony Kushner observes, were news, and Jewish issues were common in public discourse, literature, and press. A positive spin on that news could perhaps facilitate naturalization for Jewish refugees in Britain, as well as garner support for the fledgling state of Israel. What's also evident is that there was a good deal of self-consciousness and ambivalence about making those goals of the festival patent. The Scotsman, for example, reported at a press conference that organizer Benno Schotz said that the Festival of Jewish Arts was not intended to present Zionist propaganda. It was to be judged on its own merits, as it was purely a cultural enterprise. That's the end of the quote. And the arts exhibit selections too, which I'll show you in the program in a minute, also tended to evade some of the more obvious wandering Jew themes and images that were nevertheless key to that cultural enterprise, and indeed were a focus of many of the Jewish artists of that period, including Chagall and Herman and Schotz and Adler, who had all created some of their most famous work of the period around the theme of the Jewish refugees. These, notably, were not on display. So what was then Jewish, but not Zionist, about the art for these organizers? In a close examination of the exhibition guide and its media coverage, as well as the reviews of the performances, one can uncover a Jewish cultural heritage that combined a kind of refined Central European high culture with the ancient Jewish past, and a somewhat hesitant embrace of an old world folksy image of Jewishness, kind of, implying a kind of kitschy type of Jewishness of the Fiddler on the Roof type. And while, like Ida, some of the organizers had qualms about overtly highlighting issues around Jewish refugees and persecution at what was supposed to be a celebration of culture, neither could one sidestep the recent murder of Jews by the Nazis without disrespecting the memory of the victims, remembering the art lost, the music silenced, the synagogues destroyed, the publishing houses burned, and the lives of a new generation of producers of Jewish culture cut short. So I'll first take a look at the program booklet. And Lee, I'll just ask you to share the screen so we can take a look at that. There we go. So I'll once again turn to Kirschenblatt Gimlet while looking at this program booklet, because she importantly identifies program booklets as a very key element in the distinct character of festivals, which I find very fascinating. Now, she posits that because, I'm going to quote her here, festivals are generally less didactic and less textual than museum exhibits, and they are more performative as well, they reserve extended textual analysis for the program booklet. So in this way, they avoid the awkwardness of discoursing about living people in their very presence. Now, if one reads the Festival of Jewish Art's program booklets as ideological and political texts, one can see the lines of conflict between exhibiting and celebrating a very vibrant Jewishness, but at the same time, memorializing the recent loss of culture in Europe. So that supports my haunting theory, because the way I read these program booklets, there are reminders and mentions of the Holocaust and the devastation it wrought in virtually every section of the program booklet and in the explanatory notes of the exhibition guides, even if it's very subtle. So in Glasgow's Festival of Jewish Arts, the exhibition guides were separated into 3 booklets, printed by the University Press in Glasgow. One was the Festival of the Art Exhibition Guide. The second was the 1951 Art Exhibition Catalog with painting, sculpture, watercolors, drawings, and etchings. And the third was the theater program booklet for the Dybbuk. So first I'll turn to the Festival of Art Exhibition Guide, which contained information about organizers, contributors, the program of events, including 2 live musical performances, 2 film viewings, 1 theater performance, and lectures, again, as I mentioned, by amazingly famed philosopher Martin Buber on the biblical dialogue. There was also Joseph Herman, who gave a really interesting lecture from the sounds of it on Jewish art. I would have liked to be there. And there was also well-known writer and translator of Yiddish literature, Joseph Leftwich, gave a lecture on Yiddish literature. There were also informative but very culturally sensitive explanatory notes and lists of items on display in the exhibits for antiquities and Jewish music and Jewish books. And they were also separated into Hebrew literature and Yiddish literature and Jewish literature. So in the next PowerPoint slide, you can see the art exhibition. And this catalog not only listed a very impressive array of works from the 19th century onwards, but it also included the very first fully illustrated catalog of Jewish artists' work ever to be produced. And this was to be reproduced in part and then added to for the art catalog of the Festival of Britain's Anglo-Jewish exhibition at the Ben Uri Gallery in London, which was held that summer between the 9th of July and the 3rd of August. Although the difference was that they took out those Jewish artists who had no connection to Britain. Lastly, on the next slide, see, yes, that was right, that photograph. Yes, exactly, that photograph, which is a real photograph from the of the stage of the festival. And there was a separate booklet that accompanied the theater production of the Dybbuk. And it was a reprint and translation of a foreword by renowned Jewish thinker Chaim Zitlovsky. Now, the Dybbuk, which was written by S. Ansky in 1914, is set in a small Jewish town in mid-19th century southern Russia, and it tells the tale of a young bride who is possessed by the soul of her dead lover on her wedding day. It was, and it still is, one of the most famous modern Jewish plays, whose productions surely went into the thousands. And it grew to distinction when it was staged in Moscow by the Habima Theater in 1922, directed by Stanislavski student Eugene Vakhtangov, whose very edgy avant-garde direction and set design led to its accolades and high critical acclaim as it toured around the world for the next 2 decades. The explanatory notes about Jewish history and culture in the exhibition guide, and the formal lectures and films and the music and the theatrical performances were all very typical of post-war ethnographic festivals. So it followed a kind of a typical structure. They also encapsulated a very unified message about Judaism and its culture in a way that could synthesize rather complex material, but also educate for a non-Jewish audience. They created a dividing line within the Jewish community as well, between those who are licensed to do and those who are mandated to watch. All of the essays in the guides were written by celebrated and distinguished Jewish intellectuals of the time. In the case of the art catalog, the foreword written by Benno Schultz, it's clear that the aim is to highlight that Jews have a respectable and elite culture, and their artists show both variety as well as a coherence of unity and temperament and treatment. So there's a synthesis. Now, it's very difficult to ascertain exactly what that means, especially in terms of art. But perhaps one can discern a sense of melancholy in a number of the works, or to interpret certain of the pieces as reactions to persecution or as a response to modern Jewish experience. Many of the works, however, appear to be included simply because the artist was of Jewish heritage. If the viewer is meant to let art speak for itself, the text of the art catalog nevertheless intimates that there are considerable omissions left in this display that they are viewing, namely the art that cannot speak for itself. This, the catalog explains, is because of the difficulty in securing Jewish works of art after the war. And these omissions due to war are made even more prominent in other parts of the exhibitions and the exhibition guides. A more blatant reference to missing art pieces, for example, accompanies other texts in the exhibition guide as well. In the case of the display of antiquities, for example, the focus was on ancient heritage and the creative and artistic forces of early Jewish life, as the author of the explanatory notes explains to the reader. With objects dating back to the 13th century, both from the Makata collection, which had not been displayed since before the war, as well as private collections, the display must have been truly remarkable. There were spice boxes, there were goblets for making kiddush, there were military medals of prominent Jews, scrolls, pointers for reading the Torah, there were keys to synagogues, prayer books, Hanukkah lamps, amulets, circumcision tools, manuscripts. All of these pointed to a very rich religious and cultural heritage of the Jewish community of the time and its legacy of goldsmiths and metalworkers and scribes. But even so, also part of this legacy, as the author of the explanatory text reminds its readers, are the artifacts lost. The author tells us, unfortunately, only fragments of the art which abounded in medieval times remain with us today. In recent times, the Holocaust wreaked by the Nazis in Europe destroyed hundreds of Jewish libraries, museums, and private collections. This is a very early use, actually, of the word Holocaust. Similar statements accompany the texts that explain the history and cultural context for the book exhibit, with manuscripts dating back to the 18th century, such as and even the 17th is a very rare translation into Yiddish of the Romance of King Arthur and His Knights from 1699. But then too, attendees are reminded of the void in literature left in the wake of Nazi terror. and the vandalism which destroyed the libraries and publishing houses. To this end, there was a display of new literature in the book exhibit, the writings of the Horban of destruction. It included books and documents and diaries and statistics and eyewitness accounts of survivors of the ghettos and death camps and the underground and resistance movements, most of which were collected in this display under the editorship of Mark Turkoff in Argentina. Only the music section, oddly enough, did the author of the explanatory note, Moscow Karner, who was a well-known musicologist and conductor and critic at the time, appear to eschew any longing or loss for the Jewish past by completely and unapologetically rejecting the relevance of Jewish music. So synagogue compositions and folk songs and hymns, according to Karner, could not be considered art music and do not contain typically Jewish traits, according to him. So the music exhibit, which included both live performances and gramophone concerts, only included a selection from Mahler, Schoenberg, Bloch, and Mendelssohn, the latter being the only one the author considered near real greatness. The program guide for the Dybbuk also aimed to educate the non-Jewish public with a very evocative view of Hasidism, endorsed by an explanation of Hasidism that accompanied the program. It was a reprint of Chaim Zitlovsky's A Note on Hasidism. And at the time he wrote it, Zitlovsky notably advocated for a socialist, secularist Jewish nationalism based on Yiddish culture in the diaspora. But the essay describes the Jewish spiritual movement of Hasidism in wistful terms as the last great religious movement in Jewry of Eastern Europe. The play was positively reviewed when it was performed in Glasgow by the Jewish Institute Players, and it clearly intrigued audiences with its very relatable folktale and high art aesthetics. On the other hand, spectators coming to the festival to learn more about Judaism would be faced with the paradoxes of choosing such a play to celebrate Jewish culture. The play is rather gloomy, and the alien atmosphere constructed by the depiction of the small town, the shtetl, and its outmoded practices were enhanced by quite stereotypical costumes of old rabbis with beards and eerie interpretation of Jewish-looking spaces and dress, and the expressionist set designs which were actually designed by Glasgow artist Tom MacDonald. Only 1 year later, a televised London-based adaptation of the play for BBC was panned in the press as creepy, gloomy, superstitious, and alien, although the Glasgow audiences loved it. So we can shut the PowerPoint because I'll just conclude to reflect on what was important to the leaders of the Glasgow Jewish community at the time. The Festival of Art in many ways presented a Jewish identity that contained a pastiche of, on the one hand, an image of a beautiful and authentic past, and on the other hand, a modern multicultural cosmopolitanism that was both distinct in its Jewishness and also unified with Scottish and British identity. But there was a reluctance to omit altogether what was a main concern for Jewish communities all over Europe. And that was how to be Jewish in the wake of loss of material culture, how to regenerate that culture in the shadow of trauma and devastation wrought by the Holocaust. And Glasgow's Festival of Arts presents a very enigmatic case of a community struggle to register hope and loss and pride, and to look at the future while still looking back at the past. The Glasgow Festival of Jewish Arts closed on Sunday, the 2nd of March at 6 p.m. with the singing of Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the Song of Hope. The festival was a tremendous success, with, according to the Jewish Echo, over 10,000 registered visitors. The organizers could in fact claim that they had shared an important aspect of Jewish contributions to the arts with the Scottish public. As the editor of the Echo reported, the exhibition was designed purely as an artistic event, yet we cannot but be impressed by the great value of such a display in our relations with our non-Jewish neighbors. In this artistic atmosphere, divorced from all question of dogma, can best be furthered that amicable relationship which is so much to be desired between faiths. The value placed on the festival's capacity to smooth those interfaith relations at the same time belies a sense of vulnerability felt by members of Glasgow's Jewish populace as they stood at the turning point of their self-construction as Scottish and British Jews in a post-Holocaust world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mia. That was extraordinarily rich and thought-provoking. We do, with your permission, have a little bit of time for questions and discussion, so I hope that that's okay with you. I've got lots of questions, but I'll not hog the floor, and I'll ask anybody else if they would like to kick the conversation off after that really very remarkable talk. Bob.
Yes, if I may, David. And Mia, thank you very much indeed. It was indeed a rich talk. I'll apologize that my Zoom connection went down for about 3 or 4 minutes in the middle. So if this question picks up on something that you said during that period, you have my apologies. What I really benefited from hearing early on in your talk was the immense wealth of talent that was around at the time that enabled the festival to take place. Both the wealth of talent in terms of being able to bring in international figures of renown, as well as a wealth of talent available locally to organize it. And it's almost, I would be surprised had there not been such a festival. It's almost as though, given the wealth of people around, the question would have been, well, why hadn't there been such a festival? So it's no surprise to me that there was one, given what you've said. But picking up something towards the end, if I may ask, how to be Jewish in the shadow of the Holocaust. And this was in part the Jewish community registering a hope for the future. And I wonder, what has continued as a benefit from the festival, or indeed, have the benefits of the festival perhaps been lost in an increasingly pluralist and increasingly secular society?
That's a really great question. I'm going to take a minute just to gather my thoughts, since there's a lot in that question, actually. And in some ways, it's also tied to a very changing population, a Jewish population in Glasgow, if you're talking about, in some ways, a local lesson. Glasgow's Jewish community has always and even still does consider itself as packing more than its numbers, in terms of its activity and its cohesiveness. But the truth is that it's a shrinking community. From the 20,000 or anywhere between 18, 20, there are a few different estimates of what those numbers were in the post-war period to now, which is a quite synagogues are closing and the community is very quickly shrinking. And many people can wonder why that is. Why is the community shrinking? And for one thing, it could be seen as a very sad thing, or people losing their identity. It could be also a good sign. People who are very strong in their identity, the children of those cultural contributors, moving on to bigger centers. Maybe that's a success story, or that it was so pluralist and so comfortable to be in Scotland. You know, Scotland has a reputation of having less anti-Semitism, for example, or people experiencing less anti-Semitism than in other places. It could be that people just assimilated and integrated into the society. So, you know, there isn't one answer in terms of that lesson of hope. But I think there's also still a struggle of Jewish memory. Jewish memory is still a very important and key focus of Jewish identity today. In many ways, memory has sometimes replaced religious identity and affiliation itself, right? Where there's a lot less observance, but there's still a very important part of Jewish identity linked up with memory and memorializing the past that in some ways unifies a very diverse and dispersed and complex idea of Jewishness today.
Mm. Mm.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Mm. Could I ask? I mean, clearly this was a festival of Jewish culture, but you ended almost ended with the term religion, and how far you can dissociate culture from religion, and particularly in the context. And I'm thinking, you know, at the moment we're in another kind of refugee context with we have a Ukrainian guest who's been with us now for quite a long time, and that's always a very complicated and complex and traumatic experience, both for particularly obviously the refugees, but also the place that they've come to. And yet you've got here a context in which you've got part of the community settled since, as you said, the 18th century, but some of them would be coming homeless and dispossessed and traumatized, I guess. I mean, how far can you dissociate and distinguish the cultural from the religious, and the kind of religious questions that the Holocaust provokes for all religious communities?
In terms of, I think, Jewishness, you know, Judaism and Jewishness are somewhat, separate concepts. And, you know, the festival of ours was very much talking about Jewishness, you know, the Jewish culture and Jewish identity. It's very difficult actually to separate the two, Jewish culture and Jewish religion. It's in some ways easier for, you know, I'll just give, you know, my personal situation is growing up, you know, as an Orthodox Jew. You know, religion was a main part of it, but that is not the regular experience for most Jewish people. The people who are consider themselves religious or observant are a small minority of the larger Jewish population. So in many ways, when we talk, maybe getting back to Bob's question about hope, grappling with some of the theological questions about loss and hope might have been easier or harder for people for whom Judaism is a religion rather than a culture. In some ways, having cultural continuation can be an answer, and an answer without religion, right? It means that the hope is to continue being a people, continue creating, continue, being an important part of history while still, you know, continuing a generation to whom Judaism is important. You know, can one do that without the religion is a question, you know, that in some ways it's the question of that play that was at the center of that 1951 festival, which is the Dybbuk, is actually a question of whether to fulfill personal fulfillment rather than responsibility to community. And I don't know if there's an answer to that. Actually.
Okay. Thank you. Other people questions?
Yes.
Alison.
Have I unmuted myself? Yeah.
No, you're fine.
I don't know whether this is a question or not, but I was wondering whether the organisers of the festival, whether this is typical with festivals, that I was wondering whether there was work commissioned, or whether it was not like that. Thinking in terms of some of the questions that you're posing, was that too difficult to ask people to create something on the spot? Was it more about memory? I mean, I think new work is sometimes part of a festival, the kind of raison d'etre of a festival, but I'm not sure what the balance was or whether that was an issue.
It's hard from the evidence that we have from the festival. I didn't find any kinds of records of work commissioned for the festival, and the art exhibition catalog seems to be a collection of works borrowed and taken from people's private collections rather than those artists creating. But Joseph Harmon and Janko Adler, who were significant modernist artists of the time, did create work in Glasgow at the time that very much addressed their experience of the period. It wasn't specifically for then, it was really just in the late 30s and early about their experience of being alienated in Scotland and refugees and finding out about their families or not finding out about their families and so on. So I think there was a couple of meaningful works like that, but it seemed to me that the goal was more international than local. What was commissioned, interesting enough, is Tom MacDonald's set designs and the costumes for the Dybbuk, which are themselves pieces of art, actually. So.
Yeah, that is interesting. And he was Jewish. No. So.
Yeah.
So
and his wife Betlo was designed the costumes, and she was also not Jewish. But there was a kind of feeling that maybe Scottish. There was a kind of sympathy or an empathy with a spiritual world that was in Scottish folklore that I think it seemed to come out in some of the kind of reception, the very positive reception of it.
How interesting! Yes, thank you.
One of the words you used in the in your little description of your talk was reconstruction or reconstructing. How far did you see this as did this event perceive itself as a reconstruction of identity at a time when I guess people were probably, I mean, I may be wrong, but I mean, people would not have been quite so. Most people would not have been so conscious of the Holocaust as probably they are now, with all the kind of books and films and histories and so on and so forth, that it was too close to the Second World War, I suspect, for people to be quite as intensely aware of what has been happening in the camps and so on. So how far was this perceived as a reconstruction, as opposed to something like I was going to say the Battle of Britain, the Festival of Britain, which was one senses a great celebration of a national identity, So was this an opportunity to reconstruct something that had been fractured, broken?
Interesting. I think there was a lot more actual knowledge about the Holocaust, and it was in the news, and it was part of people's personal experiences and memories of people that they knew in terms of the Jewish community. And that goes to a question of who the festival was for. And it's very interesting to read some of the festival organizers' purpose, because on the one hand, they keep mentioning our children. You know, this is for our children. And one wonders if maybe there was a lot of purposeful forgetting rather than not knowing, you know, this was so traumatic that let's not talk about it. And maybe what they were facing was a generation of children who are not interested in Judaism as well and in their Jewish culture, and starting maybe to assimilate or integrate a little bit more than they thought of, or didn't appreciate that Jewish culture was a live culture rather than a culture of persecution and victimhood. As I mentioned, Jews were also in the news all the time. There was the refugees. It kept talking about the refugees. There are still people in DP camps. You know, they were finding, you know, they had opened up those concentration camps for not very long before that. There were newsreels that were still very fresh in people's memories, but it wasn't an image of Jewishness that those organizers wanted for their interfaith relations. They wanted, we are real people and we are contributors to this nation and we're British. And they, in some ways, there was, I felt, at least from reading a lot of these notes, that they wanted to get away from that image of victimhood and that image of Jews being synonymous with refugees, and to really establish themselves as having a pride in their culture and being future oriented. So in that way, it was a regeneration. There was so much lost, but there was a desire to also not be identified by the loss, but rather be identified by what there was and what there could be, what a contribution could look like. So in some ways, it was a new self-construction that had to be very purposeful in some ways, to a kind of a pull and push between, you know, paying respect to those who are lost and respecting their memory, but also not wanting to be identified by them.
Any other people want to contribute or say something? Yeah, John.
Maybe I've just come back a couple of days ago from the other second city of empire, Calcutta, and in fact I was on a trip to India with our colleague Ophira, and but I was anyway. But I was visiting the synagogues of Calcutta, and there are 3 quite grand synagogues, but now a Jewish community that is numbers, I think, 18, who are all over 70, and but Calcutta probably had a similar kind of a comparable Jewish population, to Scotland probably, as you said, which sort of numbered around a few thousand, and then increased rapidly in the 30s, and then declined again, and then declined very rapidly after 1947. But it's just, I was just thinking, it's a feature of the communities of minority heritage, we might call them that. I mean, it's the same for the Chinese community in Calcutta and the Armenian community. But perhaps the first thing that goes is those sort of cultural institutions and things like newspapers, social clubs, and these kinds of things. And to what extent is that happening in Glasgow? And is there any sense of loss going on, in the present Jewish community?
Very much so. This, just a few months ago, one of the 4 synagogues in Glasgow amalgamated with another, so that that makes, Glasgow having had 11 synagogues now has 3. And sometimes, I'm sure similar to churches, it could be that suddenly there's a roof leak and that's it, no synagogue, because there's no members and there's no money to fix the roof. But also just a shrinking need for those resources means those institutions have to be kept up. So Glasgow still has many of its institutions that are kept up through a community trust, but the synagogues are closing and they're empty. There's still a Jewish school in Glasgow, which is a good sign, but affiliation and observance means that restaurants can't keep open, and there are fewer goods and services available. So yeah, that definitely is an issue. Some of the smaller communities are also struggling with, there were synagogues all over Scotland. But it is something that's a very real topic within the Jewish community, is wanting to attract people, wanting to look to the future, but also maintain an aging community and the services that are needed.
That's not all that dissimilar from some of the experiences of the churches, and particularly the Church of Scotland, which is going through a very cataclysmic diminution, as it were. But yeah, I've just got one last specific question, and you may not have an answer to it really, but I'd be fascinated to know what contribution Martin Buber actually made in his lecture, if we know. I mean, obviously he has there are particular connections with Glasgow, with the translation of I and Thou here in Glasgow. But do we know what his contribution was?
We know that he gave a lecture. We don't have the notes of that lecture.
Okay.
There was a review of the lecture in the Jewish Echo that Martin Buber then replied to and said, "No, you got it wrong."
Oh, okay.
But I don't know if that lecture was ever published. I mean, the fact that there was already a Glasgow connection because of the translator might have played into it. I don't know which was first, actually, but I imagine that the translator was first. But that in itself would be an interesting.
Yeah, I'm just curious
a bit more.
Yeah. We're drawing close to the end of our time together, but is there anything else that anybody wants to say before we conclude?
Fine.
Yeah, Nicholas.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. I serve as a Christian priest in a part of the town in which 2 of the 3 surviving synagogues are located, and one that most recently closed was also in this area, and in a spirit of ecumenism, it should be the envy of any Christian church, not in speaking terms of the other one that abutted on it. But a couple of observations on I made recently. I have friends who send children to one of the Jewish schools where most of the parents arrive for their parents' evenings wearing a hijab.
Yeah.
I have once been asked whether I could do a funeral without mentioning Jesus for a family that had fallen out with one of the synagogues. But the more encouraging is a few months ago at Hanukkah, what I felt was a sign of renewed confidence in the Jewish community locally is that the two synagogues had clearly got together on neutral territory in a civic amenity, and clearly predominantly Orthodox, but you know, showing themselves in public, the Hanukkah candle in the main toll in the middle of Clarkston, and whatever may be going on with numbers. I mean, the age profile was certainly a great deal younger than my congregation, and I thought there was actually renewed confidence in the community.
Yeah, I would agree that, you know, actually the school, although as you say, the school is not, it's a Jewish school where, I don't know, I would estimate, don't quote me on this, you know, it's probably 65% Jewish, the other percentage being made up of Muslim students and some Christian students or unaffiliated. A lot of children also come from marriages of, you know, where one parent is Jewish and not both. And, you know, it goes back to that religion and culture question, and where I think there's a very strong attachment to Jewish culture and a very proud attachment to Jewish culture. Jewish institutions like synagogues or facilities that are used by observant Jews are not necessarily being used by that younger generation. So that's probably also quite similar in some of these communities that are either people are becoming very religious and moving, or they're becoming, you know, more assimilated and perhaps affiliating more culturally than religiously, which means they're not using the institutions, but they're still, you know, proud and here and identifying.
But it does seem that the ethos of the school is one that is attractive to people of other faiths. Just as is also true of the Catholic schools, which are attractive to people of other faiths, and it's a kind of standing apart from the mainstream together from this mainstream secular society. Yeah,
I mean, it goes back to that first question, which is about hope, which, you know, was also, you know, maybe in 1951 we're still asking the same questions, where there was a lot of focus on hope. What is the future? You know, what are we teaching our children? How are we, you know, raising them? There was a lot about, you know, how are we passing on this heritage to the children? And also very important to Glasgow always has been interfaith connections, and strong interfaith connections have always been very important. In a way, for example, I coming from Canada, you know, there wasn't a strong, you know, interfaith community or a strong necessity for that, as there is, you know, probably in Scotland, but also in the wider UK, I think.
Thank you. I think that's a very positive note, certainly about Glasgow to conclude on. But I'm sorry, the numbers have been small, but they've been, you know, very appreciative, and it's been an extraordinarily rich presentation. And thank you very much indeed, Mia, for taking time to do this. I know it's a busy time of the year for you, so thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and listening. It's been a real pleasure.
I could just say, maybe as a sort of a plug, there'll be an exhibition in the University Chapel later on this year of a German artist who was a prisoner of war during the Second World War, and when he returned to Germany actually built a synagogue, though he was not himself Jewish, and his son is now helping to show some of his work. So I think probably, Mia, I'll be coming back to you for some conversations about that, because it's an interesting project. But thank you for your information, insights, and presence with us. We're very grateful indeed. And could I just say that we will be meeting again on the last Thursday of next month, which is Thursday, the 27th of April. And another member of the department from Glasgow, Doug Gay, will be speaking on the timely subject of Scottish nationalism. So I think he'll probably have quite a lot to say about that, knowing Doug. So that's our next meeting on the 27th of April at the same time. So thank you very much, especially thanks to Mia, and thank you all for coming. Thank you. Bye-bye.